Eugenics was about cleansing society by weeding out people with physical or intellectual disabilities, for instance. Justice Holmes wrote one of the most infamous opinions in the history of the court, where he said 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And we think that, well, it can't happen here. Well, it did. Those policies ended up making it almost impossible for European Jews to escape to the United States when the Nazi persecutions began. Eugenics also has resonances even today. There's a philosophy around the world that certain people are less worthy than others, that certain nations, that certain races are inferior or superior.
Welcome to Finding Communion. I'm Rosemary Ford, editor of Parable Magazine. I'm here with Bob Dunn, the Director of Public Policy for the Diocese of Manchester. Here on Finding Communion, we talk about the intersection of religion, politics, and the Eucharist. And we follow up on discussions we start in Parable Magazine. Today, we're going to be tackling eugenics, following up on Bob's excellent column on the same topic in Parable Magazine. And if you haven't checked out Parable Magazine, I hope you'll check it out online at catholicnh.org/parable, or if you're a parishioner in the Diocese of Manchester, hopefully it's in your mailbox. So, Bob, today we're talking about eugenics. First, for our audience who may not be familiar, what is eugenics? And can you explain a little bit about what that is?
Sure. Eugenics was a quack medical theory that had a lot of sway in Western Europe and in the United States in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And it was about cleansing society, about societal hygiene, so to speak, by weeding out people that were deemed to be less desirable, people with physical or intellectual disabilities, for instance. This led to the idea that you could, through making sure that only those deemed to be fit and superior would reproduce, that in the long run it would be better for society and there would be fewer people that would be burdens on society as these folks saw it. Mm-hmm. So this theory was believed in by many people in the West meaning Europe and the United States, and many opinion leaders and thought leaders. There were actually more than 30 states in this country which passed laws that were eugenically or were eugenics based, laws that provided for the sterilization of individuals that were deemed to be inferior.
That's crazy.
And then, of course, that regime in this country was part of the inspiration for the Nazi eugenics policies that were put into place. And those policies led to about 350,000 Germans who were sterilized and about 250,000 who were actually euthanized, that they were deemed to have lives unworthy of living, as they said. And they were killed, so-called mercy killings. And so in this country, the reason that we think about eugenics today, because it's not something that we often remember, but there is a famous U.S. Supreme Court case that came up in the 1920s called Buck v. Bell. And maybe we can chat about that here today.
Sure, yeah. Let's talk more about that. The case you mentioned, it involves Carrie Buck. Can you tell us a little bit about who Carrie was and why she's gone down the annals of history?
Carrie Buck was a 17-year-old citizen of Virginia, and she was committed to what Virginia called the Virginia Colony for Epileptics and the Feeble-Minded. It was soon after Virginia passed one of these eugenics sterilization laws. She was sent there because she was deemed to be incorrigible. She was deemed to be feeble-minded. It appears, by the way, that those things were not true, but anyway, she was sent there, and the authorities at the Virginia colony sought to have her sterilized. And at that point, the statute under which this was happening was challenged, and the case ultimately made its way up to the Supreme Court. And in 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court decided the case of Buck v. Bell. And that's why Carrie Buck's name has come down to us through history. Obviously, no one would have remembered her if her name had not been attached to this famous, or I should say infamous, U.S. Supreme Court decision. The court in that case decided that the Virginia statute was constitutional. And that's hard for us to believe over 100 years later, or almost 100 years later. But the court decided that case by an 8-1 margin. There was only one justice who voted against that decision, and that was Justice Pierce Butler, who was the only Catholic on the court. The opinion was written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, and many people perhaps have heard of Holmes because he's seen as one of the great leading jurists in the history of the United States. Well, in this case, Justice Holmes wrote one of the most infamous opinions in the history of the court, where he said notoriously that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. That was what he said in his opinion. And so Carrie Buck ended up being sterilized under that law, and about 60,000 Americans were sterilized under those other state statutes that existed, including New Hampshire. New Hampshire in 1929 passed one of those laws. And so as we hear stories like this and we think that, well, it can't happen here, well, it did happen here.
Literally happened here, yep.
And these sterilizations, hundreds of them in New Hampshire, happened at New Hampshire Hospital, at the Laconia State School, and those laws weren't repealed until the 1950s. So this idea that somehow we have learned our lesson, that we value human dignity more profoundly in 2026 than we did in 1926, I think history would say otherwise.
Sure. Just to clarify, so the state was alleging that Carrie was both feeble-minded and promiscuous. That was part of the reason for sterilizing her. And everything we know about her today realizes that she was actually not allowed to go to school by her family, and there was no evidence that she was feeble-minded, and she was not promiscuous. She was actually raped by a relative, as far as we know. So, you know, the whole thing, it's heartbreaking enough to think what was done to this poor woman, but to then think that it was all just a big lie too, and wondering how many other people were put in this kind of a circumstance for things that weren't even true. It's just awful, you know. I mean, truth would not make it better, but it makes it even worse when you hear about it, you know, that, you know, there was nothing wrong with her and she still had to go through this. The injustice there is just crazy.
Injustice is a perfect word. The lesson that we can draw from this is that once we perceive that there are certain people whose human dignity can be disregarded, then all bets are off about what might happen. We see this in abortion, right? That once we say that the human rights of the young human being in the womb can be disregarded, then where are our foundations for understanding who is entitled to human rights at all? It becomes a question of might makes right. If you can pass a law that disregards the human dignity of a certain class of individuals, then just go ahead and do it. That's the idea. And cases like the case of Buck v. Bell and the whole history of the eugenics movement show us the consequences of going down a road like that. Eugenics also has resonances even today. You tell me whether you think that there's a movement afoot or there's a philosophy around the world that certain people are less worthy than others, that certain nations, that certain races are inferior or superior. Immigration, by the way, does have a direct connection to eugenics, in that many of the immigration laws that were passed in this country in the early part of the 20th century, which limited the pretty much open immigration that had existed previously, these laws were based on eugenics theory, so that the United States privileged certain countries in Northern Europe in particular and disadvantaged countries from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, or immigration from those countries, and almost entirely shut down immigration from Africa and Asia. Those policies ended up making it almost impossible for European Jews to escape to the United States when the Nazi persecutions began. So very few Jews were able to get to the United States. And in fact, the U.S. Holocaust Museum has done some research that shows that Anne Frank's family attempted to get to the United States in the wake of the Kristallnacht pogrom against the Jews in Germany, and they obviously failed at that because of the laws that were in place, the bureaucracy, and all sorts of other things. We need to see the connections that history puts before us, and not turn a blind eye. As was famously said by the philosopher George Santayana, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it.
It makes a lot of sense.
To me, one of the great parallels between the eugenics movement and the modern era is the question of physician-assisted suicide, which has been proposed on many occasions here in New Hampshire, and fortunately has been defeated every year. It's being considered around the world. There are various countries that have put it into place, including Canada right up the road.
Yeah.
And Canada, in just a few years, assisted suicide has become the fourth leading cause of death in Canada. So it shows you how pernicious this whole thing is. And assisted suicide is something that, like the eugenics movement, is based on the concept that the state can decide how what quality of life is worthy of living. Now, it's not, fortunately, assisted suicide is not the state making that decision and requiring people to undergo this procedure, but it is the state declaring that a certain quality of life, in the New Hampshire proposals, for instance, it's people with less than 6 months left to live. That the state's deciding that that's what the qualification is going to be, but it is the state making that decision nonetheless. And inevitably, there will be, even if, God forbid, that a law like that were ever to pass in New Hampshire, which seems inconceivable to me because it's just not worthy of New Hampshire. But if a law like that were to pass, there would inevitably be proposals to change what the qualifications were, to expand them, because that's what happens all over the place.
That's what happens in other states, yeah.
It happened in Canada. The terminal illness requirement has disappeared. They've added in mental illness, for instance, as being an acceptable qualification. And in this state, in a few years ago, when they were considering assisted suicide, the House Judiciary Committee at the time talked about adding in ALS, MS, and Alzheimer's as qualifying conditions. Mm-hmm. So the passage of an assisted suicide law in any state entails a decision that there are certain qualities of life that just aren't worth living. And so we need to pay attention to the consequences of what happened 100 years ago and what's happening around the world today.
Sure. And, what's the connection here with Catholic social teaching and also, with the Eucharist? How do these two things come into play when we talk about eugenics and physician-assisted suicide?
The Eucharist teaches us that all people are loved by God to the uttermost, to God coming among us, to dying for us. Mm. And so the dignity of the human being is immense. We teach that every person has inherent human dignity because they were created by God in the image and likeness of God. But there's a prayer in the Easter season which says something along the lines of, because of the death and resurrection of the Lord Jesus, we have even greater dignity than we had in the beginning. Mm-hmm. And so if there's anyone who should be out there promoting human dignity, it should be people who participate in the Eucharist, because that is what we are all about. Catholic social teaching also talks about the common good as a fundamental principle. And the common good would require that we comfort the dying, we aid them, we truly assist them in dying. Mm-hmm. We don't help them to kill themselves. We provide them with comfort and palliative care and things of that sort, so that they can die with dignity. They don't feel that they're a burden on other people, and that they understand that they are loved by God and loved by all of us.
That makes a lot of sense. And, just to clarify for people, and Catholics especially, who may be listening today, the church doesn't say that you have to suffer toward the end of your life. Can you explain that a little bit more about what church teaching is in terms of end-of-life issues?
The church has a very profound and I would say very sophisticated view of how we should approach end-of-life decisions. The church says that if you are dying, you do not need to use extraordinary measures to keep yourself alive for an indefinite period of time. Mm-hmm. So folks have the ability to make the moral decision to forego extraordinary measures and to allow the dying process to occur. And the medical side of the world would have the obligation to, in those circumstances, provide comfort care, keep the person warm, keep them fed, mm-hmm. Provide them with pain medication. Nobody needs to die in pain. The church would never say that anybody should die in pain. And as I understand it from talking to Catholic doctors, the things that you hear about on assisted suicide, in assisted suicide arguments, mm-hmm. That I want to have this available to me in case I want to die and avoid pain. The stories that people tell about people dying in intractable pain are stories that, as Catholic doctors have told me, are stories of failures of medicine, mm-hmm. not of something that is necessary to have happen. And from the church's perspective, it's unnecessary that it happens, and it should not happen in the 21st century. In that vein, I would also add that even though we hear stories all the time being made in support of assisted suicide, they're always talking about pain. In other states where assisted suicide is in place, or in other countries, invariably, the reasons that people give for availing themselves of the assisted suicide law don't involve pain. In Oregon,
that's very telling, yeah.
In Oregon, for instance, the annual report that the state of Oregon issues around their assisted suicide law says that the top 5 reasons why people every single year give for using that assisted suicide law are reasons that are based on being a burden, fearing loss of independence, and so forth. It's being a burden. I think about that, and that's why the majority of people have chosen to use this sort of law when it's in place. And
so
from a Catholic perspective, and I would say from just as American citizens, we don't want any person to feel that they are a burden. They're a gift from God. If we need to take care of somebody, it's our obligation. It is our joy to be able to care for those who are in need.
So, Bob, those are all the questions I have. I think we did a good job on this topic, as usual. So interesting. Thank you for joining us here on Finding Communion. For more on this topic, check out Parable Magazine. Again, you can find Parable at catholicnh.org/parable or in your mailbox. If you're a parishioner here in the Diocese of Manchester. If you don't find it in your mailbox, be sure to check with your pastor. And if you enjoyed this episode, we hope you like, share, and subscribe. Thank you. Until next time.